former POWs, farmers, and others who used prison labor. The internment facility was not only the first to be built in Kansas, but also the largest. Some 5,000 German prisoners were confined there from 1943 to 1945, and at one time the highest total was 4,027. The only physical remains are the Officers Club, a warehouse, a water tower base, and a stone guard tower, which has since been restored. Of course, much more remains in the photographs, sketches, paintings, and stories both of the prisoners and of their captors. For those, I welcome Mr. May.
Thank you. I want to thank you for having me here. I like to get out and talk about Camp Concordia. Sometimes the wife says I like to talk too much about it, because I've been known to go way over the time I was allotted to talk. Before I talk about the camp itself, I want to bring out a few things that people usually want to know about prisoners of war in the United States. One, why did we have them here? Why were they treated the way they were? And what happened to them after the war? Well, the United States signed the Geneva Convention of July 27, 1929. That convention stated that the host country had to remove the prisoners from the combat zone, had to feed, clothe, house, and give medical treatment to the prisoners the same as they did their own soldiers. This is one that surprises people. Had to pay the prisoners the same as they did a private in the host army. That's the pay was based on what it was in 1929. Only enlisted prisoners were required to work. NCOs could only be required to supervise, and officers didn't have to do anything but stay there. Prisoners were allowed to receive mail and send mail, and that canteens, or kind of like a PX, had to be provided. Okay, why did we bring them here? Well, the Geneva Convention said we had to remove them from the combat zone. So the ones that were captured in North Africa, all of North Africa was a combat zone. England didn't have any more space for them. Canada didn't have any place to put them. So we brought them to the United States. Another reason, since we had to feed, clothe, house, and all these things, it didn't make much sense to take up space on Liberty ships going to Europe with food or clothing or things that you're going to give to prisoners of war. The ships were coming back virtually empty, so why not bring them here where we could use them for labor? Another reason we treated them like we did, besides the Geneva Convention, is what I call the golden rule. We wanted to treat the enemy prisoners the way we wanted them to treat our people. Not saying it happened that way, but that was one reason that we treated them the way we did. Now, on Camp Concordia. In 1942, the government was looking for a place to put what they called an enemy alien internment camp. It's conjured up all kinds of visions in people's minds. Were they going to be prisoners of war? Was it going to be Japanese from the West Coast? What was going to be in these camps? Well, they looked at some places in Missouri and Kansas for one of these camps, and they selected Concordia. I imagine the fact that there was a senator by the name of Carlson from Concordia might have had something to do with it. He always denied that, but I imagine it did have something to do with it. And so the people in Concordia were anxious to get this. Most of the people were, not everybody. And in December, well, in the spring or summer of 1942, the government said, no, we're not going to put one there. We're not going to put them in the north. We're going to put them in the south where the weather's warmer and there's more agriculture and it doesn't cost so much to heat. And the camps and all these things. And so Concordia thought, well, we're not going to get the camp. But then in true government fashion, in September of 1942, they approved the funds to build the camp at Concordia, but they didn't tell the people in Concordia until it came out in the newspaper in December of 1942. Came out in the newspaper in December. The government started buying land in January. The people had to be off their land by the end of January. And there's still a few hard feelings about that. But the government bought one section north and just a little east of Concordia, Sibley Township. They bought one section of land there. They started building the camp the first week in February of 1943. By May of 1943, the camp was completed enough that they turned it over to the Army. When they started building it, it was to house 3,000 inmates, but they enlarged it while they were building it so that it could house 4,000 plus 815 guards. So you had close to 5,000 people that could be housed out at that camp. So it kind of blows people's minds today when you tell them that in 90 days, the government built a camp that the population would be equal to what the city of Concordia was at that time. Of course, the buildings weren't the best. I mean, they were basically nothing more than tar paper shacks, but the Americans out there and the prisoners were in identical buildings. It wasn't until the camp was completed that the people in Concordia learned that it was going to house German prisoners of war. Some people told me that they were relieved, that they would rather have German prisoners of war at the camp than have the Japanese Americans out there. There was still a lot of prejudice over Pearl Harbor. Although the government had 640 acres, they only used 157 of it for the camp itself. Now, the building of the camp was to be done all by union labor, and that caused some problems because, you know, the rural people weren't that much big on unions, and so when people would go to work at the camp, they wouldn't join the union. And the construction company would say, you have to join the union to work for us. People would say, okay, I quit. They'd walk across the street and hire on with another construction company and go to work for them until the same thing happened, and they'd quit there and then go to another one. There was a strike by the union labor at the camp because everybody didn't belong to the union. And the way they solved the strike, because the people that worked at the building the camp were exempt from the draft, they said, if you don't go back to work, you lose your exemption status. Next day, the people went back to work. People came from all over to work on the camp. People that had no more construction skills than nothing. But they would go into the hardware store in Concordia and they would buy used hammers and used saws, and then they'd go out to camp carrying used tools and apply for a job, and the foreman would say, oh, that saw's well used, you must really know what you're doing, so he'd hire them. Anyway, they got the camp built. An interesting story, and then I'll move on to some other things about the camp, is the water wells. One of the things they looked at when selecting a site was where there would be good water. So they tested it, good water there. So they dug a well at 75 feet, they hit water. And everybody that lived around there said, quit digging. And you know, the government engineer said, oh no, if you got good water at 75 feet, if we go a little deeper, we'll have a really good well. They went a little deeper and hit salt, contaminated the well. So they had to dig the wells 2 miles from camp and then pipe the water all the way to the camp. The hospital was a 177-bed hospital, very modern for its time. It had a sprinkler system, had its own laboratories, had its own dental clinic, its own operating room. Everything you would want in a hospital it had. The sewage from the camp was pumped into the Republican River. And today when I tell school kids that, they just, oh, all sewage in the river? Well, every town along the Republican River was doing the same thing, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for the Army to dump this sewage into the river too. As soon as they turned the camp over to the Army on the 1st of May, 1943, people started arriving. The camp commander, Colonel Sterling, showed up with his wife, and a few administrative people and some medics started coming in. But it wasn't until the 3rd of July that the first military police escort guard companies, these are companies that were specifically to take care of prisoners, came in on the train. The 456th and the 457th arrived on the same day. They came from Camp Custer in Michigan, where they had not completed their training. They didn't know where they were going until they were on the train, which was what happened then. Then when the train left Camp Custer, after they'd been on the train for several hours, and they told them they were going to Concordia, Kansas, and all these guys go, where? Well, one of the guards, Casey Stengel, he was from Omaha, and he happened to know where Concordia was, so that was all right with him. He was a little closer to home. But most of them said, hey, we're going to the middle of the boondocks. Well, that was one reason there was a prisoner of war camp there, because they didn't want it close to cities. On the 15th, only 12 days later, the first 400 prisoners came in. These 400 prisoners had been captured in North Africa, part of Rommel's Africa Corps. Some of them had been fighting since 1939, and they really didn't have or hold their guards in too high esteem, because here they were being guarded by guys that haven't even completed their training yet. But they went along. Camp Concordia at first was just like many other prisoner of war camps, because the Army's policy when we first got these Germans in was don't make waves. The German officers and NCOs have kept these guys in line in the German Army. They can keep them in line in a prisoner of war camp. So that's kind of what happened at Concordia. Only problem was, there were 1,000 German officers at the camp, 3,000 enlisted men. Most of your German officers and most of your higher NCOs were hardcore Nazis. These guys tended to run the prison camp on a Nazi style. They devised a radio. They would get the German version of how the war was going. They would pick that up on their radio. And at night, they would have a meeting. Every barracks had to send people to this meeting. And they would give the German version of the war. If some barracks didn't have a representative there, that was noted, and the next day they paid the person in charge of that barracks a visit, and they weren't pleasant. So things were kind of run by the Nazis in the camp. And that was all right with Colonel Sterling, because things were quiet in the camp. The Germans weren't causing problems. They were going out to work on the farms, coming back, camp was quiet, he was happy. But he also was very lax on the guards. Other than the general orders the Army had, there were no specific orders for any of the guard posts. He would have Well, the officers club had slot machines and all these things in the officers club, and he would have an officers call at 10 o'clock every morning. And then if the officers had something to do, they could go back to work. If not, they could just stay in the club the rest of the day. So it kind of had a country club atmosphere, if you want to call it that. Well, there were some things that happened. Captain Tropschuh in the German army, he was actually Austrian, had kept a diary. He had kept this diary while he was in North Africa, and he kept it while he was a prisoner. And he was very critical of the German army, and he was critical of the Nazis and Hitler. His mistake was all this was written down, and the hardcore Nazis found his diary. So one night, they had a court-martial. And they told him, or they convicted him of not being a good German. They told him he could do the proper thing or his family would suffer. Well, since they could pick up radio news from Germany, he figured they could probably also get news back to Germany. And of course, they were convinced that Germany was still going to win the war. So if they hadn't been in a prisoner of war camp, they would have given him a pistol with one bullet in it, and he would have known what to do with it. But since they didn't have any firearms, they gave him a rope, put him in a room with a chair, and said, do the proper thing or your family's going to suffer. Then they put a guard on the door and a guard on the window, and he hung himself. Next morning, when he didn't show up for the roll call, everybody, the Americans figured, oh, another one killed himself, another suicide. And that's what they wrote it off as. But they should have taken, paid attention to what was going on, because the Germans, there had been a couple other Germans die at the camp. And the German spokesman said, we do not want Tropschuh buried next to these other good German soldiers. So the commander gave in, and Tropschuh was buried on the opposite side of the cemetery from the other two Germans. Well, one of the prisoners had a sister visit him from Chicago. And he told his sister, Tropschuh's death was not a suicide.